First Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to Newsline, live from the Newsfirst studios in Colombo. And joining me this morning is the man back from whaling and dolphin watching, the one and only Bandala Jayaseka.
Yeah, we missed you yesterday, Faraz.
I was seasick.
Yeah, we heard that now you were swimming with the sharks.
Indeed, I had a very nice shark yesterday. Nice fellow. And we're also joined by Professor Rajiva Vijay Singha. Very good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Faraz. Nice
and how are you?
Tired.
Are you?
Yes.
Because you've been writing. You've run...
Writing, walking, working.
And
working.
Very exhausting for
the Parliament is missing the troublemaker, one of the troublemakers.
The troublemaker was an analyst.
Professor,
Parliament can't cope with that.
We've got a number of questions, but why don't we first start with this? Prior to the elections, we urged the people to vote wisely. In the context of what went on in Parliament, those sort of scenes of uproar, do you think the people have chosen wisely or correctly?
Well, let me put it this way. I think on our electoral system it is impossible to choose wisely because there are so many extraneous factors that come into the electoral process. And I think the greatest betrayal of the movement of last January, which brought what I think is still the right choice to power in terms of the president, was the absolute failure to implement the promises in the manifesto, and in particular the promise about electoral reform. And we know that the president actually promised the then opposition group that he wanted their support for reducing his own powers, which is a sign of his commitment. But he promised that electoral reform would happen. And I'm afraid it was stymied by the UNP at the time, and they never wanted it to happen. They knew that the existing electoral system would advantage them and advantage people with a lot of money, which they managed to acquire by means you and I know about, including the central bank bomb scam. And the result is a free fall for money, which was also, I'm afraid, done by members of the opposition then. So I'm afraid we don't have a parliament that can be constructive at this moment in terms of the commitment to what is still the prevailing manifesto in this country, the presidential manifesto of January 2015.
Right. Another question from a regular viewer, whom I disclosed to that you were going to be on the program. And this is the question. Prince Hussein, during his visit, spoke of his meeting with a rape victim. The rape happened during the JVP insurrection. Does that mean the ambit of the investigation has been broadened, covertly or overtly?
No. What it clearly means is a wonderful red herring to pretend that this whole investigation is supposed to be about general rights rather than what is both Western and diaspora driven. Now, what I find extraordinarily, I suppose, entertaining is the fact that many people within Sri Lanka who demanded an international investigation are now sort of saying, no, it's not a problem because really nothing bad happened. I was on Verona the other day, and two people, one of whom I think was very, very sincere, now said, well, it doesn't matter because we all know that nothing really happened. While a very strong supporter of the present government, and indeed of General Sarath Fonseca, said, but we know nothing happened, and of course it doesn't matter, because there's nothing to be worried about. And he could not explain why the foreign minister had declared that terrible war crimes had happened. They had happened on political instructions. And I think that was such a disgrace, because he obviously hasn't understood that even if soldiers claim they did violations on orders, that is not an excuse. So I think you have a situation where we have this tremendous dichotomy between some members of the present government who, sincerely or otherwise, believe that war crimes were happening. You will recall Lakshman Kiriel in 2007 saying, there will be a UN presence in Sri Lanka and you can't stop this. That was in connection with the visit of Louis Arbour. And others who are now in government, who were part of the government of 2009, who said very clearly, there weren't war crimes. So I think this great dichotomy, and this is what you call, there was talk of a hybrid court. There is a hybrid government.
Rajiv, I think you're always angry with the foreign minister, because did you aspire to be the foreign minister or the deputy foreign minister?
Not at all. In fact, when I was put into parliament, the Swiss ambassador in 2010 said, we gather you on the national list to be foreign minister. And I said, don't be silly. A, that is a post for a very senior person, and B, as you know, when I was asked on Rupavahini what I aspired to, because I think at the time it was assumed I would be given executive office, I said the one thing I'm absolutely interested in is reconciliation, which is something I know I could do well. The foreign ministry is a difficult thing for anybody, and God bless anyone who takes on that task. I hope someone else will soon.
Rajiv, do you think that in light of the different statements and so on, and the backtracking and so on that's been going on in terms of this UN resolution and all that, do you think that the present government's commitment towards human rights has somewhat diminished?
I don't think there's been any commitment towards human rights on the part of this government. I think a lot of people who wanted change a year ago were committed to human rights, but they weren't the politicians. And I think you've seen the complete lack of attention to the manifesto, beginning with the failure to introduce a code of conduct. The right to information, I mean, that was one of the big lacuna in the existing rights in the Constitution. We were committed to it, we promised it, we promised to do it in 3 weeks, nothing happened. There was a draft, it was not a bad draft at all. When I complained that it wasn't coming before Parliament, Rajat Senaratne announced in one of his wonderful cabinet spokesmen, in fact, while Raju was complaining, we're going to bring it in 2 weeks. Nothing of the sort happened. The audit bill, nothing of the rights-based approach of January 2016 has been done. I have detailed how simple it would have been to do this in my book on reform, rights and good governance, which I'd been writing from 2012 onward. And apart from Karijoy Surya, I don't think anyone in government, and he's not in government anymore, is interested.
So Prince Zaid has come and he's gone. So what next?
Well, I think we'll have more of the same, which is more shilly-shallying. You have to remember that, one of the reasons for the imbroglio we're faced with is the failure of the last government to live up to its commitments. I think I can proudly say that I was the only person on the side of the government who from 2010 onward kept saying, do what you promised. Have an internal investigation. The evidence is all there.
Is that why you were sidetracked and sidelined?
Well, I think I was sidetracked simply because there were other people who wanted to use this threat for electoral advantage. We had this terrible situation where the attacks on us with regard to the war, launched by several countries who wanted regime change, were not dealt with. And the people in opposition at the time wanted to use these to promote regime change. The people in government who were not thinking, not studying the situation, not listening to sensible people like Danjat Tilak and Tamara Kunnayakam, kept saying, we can win elections on the basis of the threats against us. And they were using this as a commodity. And I think that was a great pity, because the charges against us, most of which cannot be substantiated at all, could have been dealt with very swiftly. The Lessons Learnt and Reconciliation Commission did a fantastic job in pointing out that most of the charges were, without even a basis. But they pointed out there were some that needed investigation, and nothing was done about investigating them.
Professor, why can't, now that we live in peace times and we are apparently committed to reconciliation, why can't the army merely, simply hand over the lands that belong to the people out there?
Well, one of the arguments I made right through that period was much more land should be given back. And what I used to argue, it's in this book, is that we cannot tell the army what is needed for security.
Yeah.
But I did point out to the army that if they say things are needed for security, they must point out why. And in one of the letters I sent, I think 5 years ago, I pointed out that the area in Palali was excessive. There was a bulge which actually could not be defended. And I said, surely, this can be given back. And a lot of areas near the sacred areas should have been given back. Now, my arguments were successful. I'm not saying they were successful, but in 2010 and 11, there were vast chunks scheduled for takeover in both Mana and in Mullaitivu. Mana by the Navy, Mullaitivu by the Air Force. Much anguish on the part of the people. And the army people told me this was unnecessary. And say Mullativa, they were going to displace 800 families, several of them, including the army, argued. It was reduced to 160. When I went up there a year later, the dissatisfaction has gone. The same with Mana. But when I went up in 2014, there was much anguish because it seemed that land was now being given to army personnel. So there was lots of unnecessary takeover of land. I used to bring this from parliament committees. I scolded Mr. Swaminathan and said, why the hell don't you come for these meetings? You know, I'm the only one raising these issues. And when I raised the issues, Rishad Badruddin piped up and said, because there's no opposition person, I'll complain. So there was a lot of errors, but you need transparency. There is insufficient transparency about the need for security. In Sampur, I found that the army was being blamed for taking over land. They weren't taking it over. They wanted a very small amount. It was the Minister of Economic Development, which was smuggling in takeover of land under the Emergency Act.
It's rumored that you're going to join this new party. Is it correct?
No. No one has asked me, and I have no intention of joining any other party.
Then, now your cousin, the Prime Minister, has started a democratic practice. Question time. What are your views on that?
Well, you know that the Prime Minister just says what comes at the top of his head and then does nothing about it. You may recall that he said before the election that the people who did well in the election would be given office. And then we had the mixtures before. You know, Marapana and Malik Samarekam and Sagala Ratnayaka, Akila Virat, Akila Divija did very well, but then Vasanta Sen Nayaka, Ranjan Ramanayaka were left out. And Buddhika Pathiran is a classic example of what can only be described as shocking hypocrisy.
Yeah, but this
now the questions that he answers are just as he did with the central bank bond scam. You may recall that he engaged in a diatribe at the time, attacking people like Shira Laktilaka and claiming they were behind the questions about the fraud, you know, shooting the messenger. And this is what he has been doing recently. You may recall the attacks on the media. I think, you know, he has lost touch with reality.
So this question time is going to be ineffective?
Another great farce. I mean, very simply, I'm deeply sorry that Parliament is not engaging in what my father pointed out in 1977 was necessary with regard to the opposition. The leadership of the opposition, my father said at the time, should go to the possible alternative government. It is not a question of numbers. In this case, it's not even the numbers. So I think if you're going to make Parliament serious, you must have the cut and thrust of debate, which means that the representatives of the majority of people who are not in government should have an equal say. And it is very sad that we are engaging in formulaic, theories that do not allow people a voice in Parliament. What is the point of question time? If questions can't be asked?
Let's take a short break, and when we come back we'll discuss more about the cut and the thrust in Parliament. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Newsline. And this morning we've got Professor Rajiva Vijayasinghe joining Bandula Jayasekar and myself. Professor, who's misleading whom? Is the government misleading the international community? Is the international community misleading the people of Sri Lanka?
You see, one principle I have always adopted is when you see obvious instances of hypocrisy, don't assume that the people engaged in it are hypocrites. You know, my friends, the British, whom I adore, are the most consummate hypocrites in the world. But that is because they convinced themselves of the truth of the two different things they are saying. You know, take this latest business with Julian Assange.
Yeah, this is one thing I want to know. The ruling.
Outrageous. But they're quite convinced that when it comes to Britain, they know what is right and the UN doesn't. When it comes to little countries like Sri Lanka, what the UN decides, pushed by the British, must be right and the little country must be wrong. But they genuinely believe this. So it's not not that they're hypocrites, although what it results in.
Why do you adore the British? You just said that you adore the British then.
Absolutely, because they're such consummate hypocrites. It doesn't mean I actually follow them.
Does that
seriously?
You adore them?
Sorry? I find them fun to deal with. Much more fun than, more straightforward people.
But it's very interesting you're saying that, because our friend Chandani Kirinde from the Sunday Times, she tweeted that maybe Assange should hire Amal Clooney, then things might work for him.
Yes, I saw that in your paper this morning, your article this morning.
But that's what really told by Chandani Kirinde, that then things will change for Julian Assange.
Rajiva, do you think that our dear Prime Minister, your relative,
your cousin,
Ranil Wickremesinghe, do you think he's rather dictatorial?
Well, absolutely. I mean, come on, everyone's known this for years.
Right.
No.
I mean, the UNP.
He answers all the questions.
The UNP,
very democratic.
The UNP,
Very
as
democratic.
you know, has had this leader. But of course, you know, the absolute intransigence with which he just sat there refusing to move has paid off, because he's now Prime Minister.
He's got a better sense of humor now. This is what we see. Faraz, don't you agree?
Yes, and he's also got a better hairdresser.
Well, no, I think he always had a wonderful shock of hair, even whether it was white or black. And, you know, someone asked me the other day, you know, is he good looking? I think he does have a presence. It's not quite the presence of Mahinda Rajapaksa in terms of appeal to the people of Sri Lanka, but it certainly appeals to a sophisticated audience, and you, Faraz, are obviously sophisticated.
But he's very...
He's well read, his knowledge of music, all that's very good. He's very literate.
Well, in a country of, you know, dwarfs, I think people who are slightly above the average stand out. But you know, when we were young, we didn't actually think of Ranil as a great intellectual. He's certainly much brighter than many people in Parliament now, but that is a consequence of the electoral system.
Yeah, maybe you're jealous of him, your cousin.
No, I don't think so. I remember being told many years ago when I was engaging in education, someone said that, you know, I was doing education as a step to a political career because I wanted to rival him. But to me, the role model in the Wickremesinghe family was my uncle Lakshman, the Bishop of Kurunegala, who was a good family man, but from 1977 onward, he was deeply critical of the UNP government. And of course, one of the
Rajiv,
points he made at the time...
How pained he was after the 83 riots, and he wrote that famous letter. He was really pained. I remember Bishop Lakshman Wickremesinghe. He has really a mass appeal. He's a good human being. He had a good rapport for us with the other religions. He was deeply pained. I think we miss the bishop.
Yeah, he was marvelous, and you know, from the time, you know, I was abroad, I thought in 1977 the UNP victory was a good thing because I knew the economy was doing badly. But when I came back, unfortunately in 1980 after I finished my PhD, and of course I was faced immediately with the July 98 strike and the deprivation of Mrs. Bandanayaka's civic rights. And I remember my uncle still telling me, you know, the problem is that Jaya never forgives. And I'm afraid that is a trait that Ranil has also inherited, which was not the case with his father. You know, Esmond Wickremesinghe was a lovely, generous man.
Shall we move to matters a bit more current, rather than try and dissect?
Well, in order to understand the present, you must understand the past. And one of our tragedies is we have no institutional
One of our tragedies, if I may say so, is that hardly anyone understands Ranil Wickremesinghe. Now then.
Well, ask me, I can explain it avidly.
The bond issue.
Now then, tell me.
Bond issue, again, you brought it up.
Yeah.
Tell me, what do you think the new Attorney General has been announced? Encouraging?
No, I think it's tremendously sad. I believe this is the first time that you've actually had a junior person from the Attorney General's department appointed. And I don't know whether...
So what is your...
number 2 in?
I don't know whether you recall, you can't for us, you were probably born after that, but in the late 60s, the then government attempted to appoint Mr. Amir as Attorney General. He'd been there before, he was a very able lawyer, and they also wanted to promote 2 outstanding lawyers, Bunty de Sois and F.L. de Silva, and all hell broke loose. Because if you have a system based on seniority...
So then why have the... If the only qualification is a paper seniority, then why have this Constitutional Council? You can just have a clerk appointed who will work out that this is a seniority, issue the letter, rubber stamp it and say, here you go.
No, I think the principles that is generally adopted in administration is you appoint the most senior person unless there are good reasons not to. And I think transparency would demand that, you know, when you have someone who has served a long time, if you're not going to appoint him, then you have to explain why you're not appointing him. Well, there are good reasons not to. I think, for instance, that when it came to the Supreme Court, there have been instances, again the same thing happened when Raja Wanasundara was passed over, if you remember, and we all know that Jayawarden actually told him, I'll make you Chief Justice if you give me an undated letter of resignation. And Raja Wanasundara got up and walked out. Now, I think that the principle of seniority, I'm not saying it's sacrosanct, I fully agree with you, but there must be a rationale for not following it. And I think what happened this time is again unprecedented. It's also not part of what was envisaged by the Constitutional Council amendment, that the President is supposed to recommend someone, and then the Constitutional Council can say yes or no. And if it says no, and it must do so for good reasons, that then the President can make another nomination.
No, here he recommended
he nominated three names.
Yes. And I think that was a pity, because that is passing a suggestion. I don't know what the order was.
No, order is like Suhada, Jayanta Jayasuriya and Kapila Vaidya.
I think it is then incumbent on the Council to then explain the reasons. There may be good reasons, but the nation deserves to know why a man who became deputy in the Attorney General's department has been passed over. As I said, I have not studied the department. There may be very good reasons, but you can't have these things secretive. Transparency was a commitment of this government.
For 10 years he wasn't there. He was elsewhere.
Well, then say so. Yeah. But he was Secretary of the Ministry of Justice. And that is...
And also for us it's interesting...
He lost some files while he was...
Yes. Well, then say so. But in that case, that should have been looked into earlier.
Let's move on.
But it was very interesting also to say, like in some of the papers, now they have appointed a new person. Now, whether, the person they will offer or the person will accept diplomatic positions or other things, that's we'll have to wait and see.
Indeed.
Whether it will be the same thing.
Well, this is the same thing, and I think the crowning glory of what Faraz would probably describe as family bandism. You've mentioned twice that Ranil is my cousin. But I don't think...
they are coming to London, yeah?
Yes, London. It's a wonderful appointment of this sweet lady. I used to remember her from parties in the old days.
Have you been offered, or, even roundabout, have you had any approach that they may want to ship you off to the to Hyde Park Gardens in London?
Not at all. This was suggested to me, not directly by the President, but way back in 2005 or 6, I was approached by people who were close to him about both Washington, as you know, and London. In fact, I remember when Bandar was going off, he said, well, why aren't you going off to Washington? And I pointed out that I had very good reasons not to.
But now you have a family member going to London.
Sorry, it's not my family.
You don't know this?
No, I have no idea.
It's not my family.
That's why High Commissioner, there's also the High Commission designate to London. That's what Rajiv was trying to tell you for us.
Not my family.
Then?
Amari Vijayawardene has nothing to do with me.
Then with the Prime Minister's, is it?
Remember the Prime Minister's family, but you have to remember that.
Who is it?
You were trying to explain.
Someone called Amari Vijayawardene.
Right.
Right. And again, what we pointed out in the so-called Yahapalne process, and I suggested this, is that the Foreign Ministry, I'm not saying non-career people should be banned completely. There are very good reasons for appointing
You should have the mix.
But the reasons should be given if you're appointing X or Y. So for instance, when they appointed Thisra Samrasinghe, who was magnificent, you could explain why. He had good administrative experience, he knew to answer questions dealing with what the Australians were concerned about. The same went for various military people, the same went for Danja Telaka, Tamara Kunmagam, who had enormous experience. But the same could not have been said of Jaliya Wickramasuriya. Now, Bandula, going off to Toronto, there were very good reasons for having you, which could have been put objectively. Now, I think that is incumbent on a government when it goes outside the department to explain the reasons. They don't have to be very long, but they should be subject to public scrutiny. Now, these are areas where I think we're completely betraying the commitment of the manifesto which I helped to draft. And I think it also makes a nonsense of what the government did, which was to sack everybody immediately, including people who had established extremely good relations with the countries they were in.
So now for us, you can call on the new High Commission when you go to London next.
Yes. When are we going to get rid of this sort of nepotistic behavior?
Well, let me say first that I think the crying priority, and Reverend Sobit and I were sobbing about this actually the last time I met him. He said my big mistake was not to insist on electoral reform immediately. But he was a very upset man because he'd assumed he'd be on the advisory council that was set up a few days after and he was left out. But I think electoral reform is the first priority. Because once you have that, you have less, let's say, need to engage in the politicking, the rewarding, that is now endemic in Sri Lankan politics, uniquely so, because our electoral system is both the maddest in the world and indeed absolutely unique to Sri Lanka.
Professor, I want to ask you this before we run out of time. What's happening with the bond? We have Sunil Handunetti, once vociferous on the bond issue. He's now chairman of CORE. Is there some sort of deal going on between the UNP and the JVP?
Well, it certainly looks like it. It's very, very sad. If you remember, another of Ranil Wickremesinghe's lies was to pledge that this would be investigated immediately after the new parliament came in. It is 6 months now.
Is he hoping, do you think, is he hoping that the people have forgotten?
I think he's not only hoping, he knows that people forget. People have forgotten.
He's not counting Bandula and
not
myself.
Counting both of you, I'm
because
afraid.
we keep reminding,
you haven't forgotten,
especially for
and I
us,
think you've
we
been very
keep
good.
reminding.
But has the rest of the media brought it up? Has the rest of the media focused on the fact that the complete lie told us at the time we were investigating? The governor's point was that, you know, auctions were a good thing, it was market forces. But as you know, recently, when they offered a bond, the interest demanded by the dealers was so high, they had to turn it down completely.
Indeed.
And this is now happening because of that completely callous money-making exercise in February last year that drove up interest rates. The central bank is now going back to what they termed were anathema private placements. Ranil launched a massive attack on Nivad Cabral viciously after the bank thing came out, when he attacked Shiral Laktilaka. It is quite clear that the private placements engaged in by the bank were not to friends and relatives, they were not to...
Do you think it's a good idea?
And this is forgotten now.
Do you think it's a good idea if the governor of the central bank at this moment releases information to display, to show how much of business his son-in-law's company has had in his tenure and how much was under his predecessor's tenure?
I think that would be a very good idea, but it will not happen. And to me, one of the great tragedies, as you put it, is the JVP. It could be a secret deal. It could be that the JVP believes that the more rope they give this government, the more likely it is that they will be the successors.
But also, like Faraz always reminds, that the governor's term is ending, right?
Yes, the governor's term finishes in, I think, in
March, right?
March or May.
Well, we can only hope that President Sirisena, who was pretty critical both in private and in public about the chicanery and the theft that was going on, he put it diplomatically in public, I hope he asserts himself, because it is time he appreciated the fact that the people elected him to be president.
And it is time that we called end to the proceedings of this morning's Newsline. Thank you, Professor, for being on our network again.
Thank you.
And we look forward to welcome you again. And Bandra, thank you very much too.
Thank you, Faraz.
On that note, we'll wish you a very good morning. Thank you for watching Newsline. Take care and God bless.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.